Then there's the whole issue of the Hannibal Doctrine, because as we know, the Palestinians were bent on taking many of their captured Israelis back to Gaza. And the Hannibal Doctrine calls for killing those people before they get there. So some Israelis were killed as a result of the Hannibal Doctrine. And then you want to remember, on top of all that, it's consistent with international law for Hamas to try to break out of the concentration camp and to engage Israeli military forces in combat, which means they're going to kill some of them. So the fact that they killed Israeli soldiers is not a case of murder. Now, there were clearly Israeli civilians who were murdered. I'd be willing to bet in the final analysis, however, that Hamas did not murder many of those Israeli civilians. But be that as it may, whoever murdered those civilians, and in my mind, committed a war crime. But I think that most of the Israelis who were killed were either soldiers, who I think are legitimate targets, or they were civilians who were killed by the Israeli forces. I think you cannot underestimate how many Israelis were killed when all that firepower was brought to bear. If you look at a lot of the pictures and you listen to what happened, it's quite clear that those Apache helicopters really wreaked havoc on everything that was down on the ground. And of course, that included Israeli civilians. So I think we have a pretty good sense of what happened. Now, is that reported in the Western media? As Susan was saying before, of course it isn't. The stories that you hear in the Western media are basically a reflection of Israeli propaganda. What's also quite stunning about this whole issue is that nobody talks about why there was a breakout. Nobody talks about the fact that this was a concentration camp and what was being done to the Palestinians was abhorrent. And of course, there was going to be a breakout from that concentration camp at some point. The Israelis like to portray this as if it were a bunch of Nazis, as if the Palestinians were the second coming of the Third Reich. And what happened on October 7th is much like what happened in the Holocaust. This is a ridiculous argument. The Palestinians were the victims. They were in this concentration camp. And you had a breakout on October 7th, hardly surprising. This is not to excuse the murdering of civilians that took place at the hands of Palestinians. I'm opposed to killing civilians for sure. But again, that I think is just part of the story. You have a much more complicated story at play here. And the more you talk in detail about what happened, the clearer it becomes that Israel bears a great deal of the responsibility for what happened that day.